around for assistance elsewhere. But the instant the boy was seen, the stork began to move. He had stood before as storks generally stand, with head bent downward and the bill pressed against the neck. But now a gurgle was heard deep down in his windpipe, as though he would have laughed. Quick as a flash he lowered the bill, grabbed the boy, and tossed him a couple of metres in the air. This feat he performed 7 times, while the boy shrieked and the geese shouted: "What are you trying to do, Herr Ermenrich? That's not a frog, that's a human being, Herr Ermenrich!" Finally the stork put the boy down entirely unhurt. Thereupon he said to Akka: "I'll fly back to Glimminge castle now, Mother Akka. All who live there were very much worried when I left. You may be sure they'll be very glad when I tell them that Akka, the wild goose, and Thumbietot, the human elf, are on their way to rescue them." With that the stork craned his neck, raised his wings, and darted off like an arrow when it leaves a well drawn bow. Akka understood that he was making fun of her, but she didn't let it bother her. She waited until the boy had found his wooden shoes, which the stork had shaken off. Then she put him on her back and followed the stork. On his own account the boy made no objection, and said not a word about not wanting to go along. He had become so furious with the stork that he actually sat and puffed. That long, red legged thing believed he was of no account just because he was little, but he would show him what kind of man Nils Holgersson from West Vemminghög was. A couple of moments later Akka stood in the stork's nest. It had a wheel for foundation, and over this lay several grass mats and some twigs. The nest was so old that many shrubs and plants had taken root up there, and when the mother stork sat on her eggs in the round hole in the middle of the nest, she not only had the beautiful outlook over a goodly portion of Skåne to enjoy, but she had also the wild briar blossoms and house leeks to look upon. Both Akka and the boy saw immediately that something was going on here which turned upside down the most regular order. On the edge of the stork nest sat 2 gray owls, an old gray streaked cat, and a dozen old, decrepit rats with protruding teeth and watery eyes. They were not exactly the sort of animals one usually finds living peaceably together. No one of them turned around to look at Akka, or to bid her welcome. They thought of nothing except to sit and stare at some long, gray lines which came into sight here and there on the winter naked meadows. All the black rats were silent. One could see that they were in deep despair, and probably knew that they could neither defend their own lives nor the castle. The 2 owls sat and rolled their big eyes and twisted their great encircling eyebrows, and talked in hollow, ghost like voices about the awful cruelty of the gray rats, and that they would have to move away from their nest, because they had heard it said of them that they spared neither eggs nor baby birds. The old gray streaked cat was positive that the gray rats would bite him to death, since they were coming into the castle in such great numbers, and he scolded the black rats incessantly. "How could you be so idiotic as to let your best fighters go away?" said he. "How could you trust the gray rats? It is absolutely unpardonable!" The 12 black rats did not say a word, but the stork, despite his misery, could not refrain from teasing the cat. "Don't worry so, Monsie House Cat," said he. "Can't you see that Mother Akka and Thumbietot have come to save the castle? You can be certain that they'll succeed. Now I must stand up to sleep, and I do so with the utmost calm. To morrow, when I awaken, there won't be a single gray rat in Glimminge castle." The boy winked at Akka. and made a sign, as the stork stood upon the very edge of the nest with one leg drawn up to sleep, that he wanted to push him down to the ground. But Akka restrained him. She did not seem to be the least bit angry. Instead, she said in a confident tone of voice: "It would be pretty poor business if one who is as old as I am could not manage to get out of worse difficulties than this. If only Mr. and Mrs. Owl, who can stay awake all night, will fly off with a couple of messages for me, I think that all will go well." Both owls were willing. Then Akka bade the gentleman owl that he should go and seek the black rats who had gone off and counsel them to hurry home immediately. The lady owl she sent to Flammea, the steeple owl, who lived in Lund Cathedral, with a commission which was so secret that Akka only dared to confide it to her in a whisper. The rat charmer. It was getting on toward midnight when the gray rats, after a diligent search, succeeded in finding an open air hole in the cellar. This was pretty high upon the wall, but the rats got up on one another's shoulders, and it wasn't long before the most daring among them sat in the air hole, ready to force its way into Glimminge castle, outside whose walls so many of its forebears had fallen. The gray rat sat still for a moment in the hole, and waited for an attack from within. The leader of the defenders was certainly away, but she assumed that the black rats who were still in the castle wouldn't surrender without a struggle. With thumping heart she listened for the slightest sound, but everything remained quiet. Then the leader of the gray rats plucked up courage and jumped down in the coal black cellar. One after another the gray rats followed the leader. They all kept very quiet, and all expected to be ambushed by the black rats. Not until so many of them had crowded into the cellar that the floor couldn't hold any more did they venture farther. Although they had never before been inside the building, they had no difficulty in finding their way. They soon found the passages in the walls which the black rats had used to get to the upper floors. Before they began to clamber up these narrow and steep steps, they listened again with great attention. They felt more frightened because the black rats held themselves aloof in this way, than if they had met them in open battle. They could hardly believe their luck when they reached the first story without any mishaps. Immediately upon their entrance the gray rats caught the scent of the grain which was stored in great bins on the floor. But it was not as yet time for them to begin to enjoy their conquest. They searched first, with the utmost caution, through the sombre, empty rooms. They ran up in the fireplace which stood on the floor in the old castle kitchen, and they almost tumbled into the well in the inner room. Not one of the narrow peepholes did they leave uninspected, but they found no black rats. When this floor was fully in their possession, they began with the same caution to acquire the next. Then they had to venture on a bold and dangerous climb through the walls, while with breathless anxiety they awaited an assault from the enemy. And although they were tempted by the most delicious odour from the grain bins, they forced themselves most systematically to inspect the old time warriors' pillar propped kitchen, their stone table and fireplace, the deep window niches, and the hole in the floor, which in olden time had been opened to pour down boiling pitch on the intruding enemy. All this time the black rats were invisible. The gray ones groped their way to the third story, and into the lord of the castle's great banquet hall, which stood there cold and empty, like all the other rooms in the old house. They even groped their way to the upper story, which had but one big, barren room. The only place they did not think of exploring was the big stork nest on the roof. where, just at this time, the lady owl awakened Akka and informed her that Flammea, the steeple owl, had granted her request, and had sent her the thing she wished for.